At my 60th birthday dinner, my son raised his glass and announced to a room full of relatives that the family heirloom wasn't mine anymore, it was his. He smiled when he said it, proud and certain, like I was just a placeholder in his story. By morning, the necklace was gone. And by the end of the week, I'd rewritten our family legacy without his name in it. My name is Lorraine Brennan, and I turned 62 weeks ago, though you wouldn't know it by the way people still talk over me at dinners, like I'm just part of the furniture now, some relic from another time that's lost its shine. I live alone in a two-bedroom house that smells like chamomile and cedar, the kind of place where light softens everything and time moves slow, almost respectfully. My days are quiet, filled with small routines, boiling water just right for tea, folding laundry in thirds like my mother did, polishing the glass cabinet where the necklace once lived. It was at my birthday dinner that the unraveling began, not dramatically, not with shouting or a fight, just a sentence that dropped like a lead weight in a room full of people pretending to celebrate me. My son, David, raised his glass after the cake, after the toast for my sister, after my granddaughter had sung a shy little version of Happy Birthday. He lifted his wine like he'd earned something, like he was marking territory, and he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Mom's just keeping it safe for me." The necklace, he meant the heirloom. The room changed after that, not in a noisy way, but in the way a storm shifts the pressure before the rain begins. No one said anything, not even my sister, who squeezed my hand under the table like a silent apology. David didn't notice. He never did. He went right back to his wine, smug and oblivious, as if he hadn't just taken something that didn't belong to him, at least not yet, maybe not ever. It was like watching someone claim a house they'd only ever driven past. I smiled, but my whole body had gone still. The necklace had belonged to my grandmother, first worn on her wedding day in 1943, a green so deep it looked like it held secrets, set in gold so soft it seemed like breath. My mother wore it next, at graduations, at her retirement, even when she didn't need to. It was her strength, her reminder. And I wore it twice. Once at my wedding, where I still believed love meant safety, and once at David's graduation, where I thought he might finally understand what legacy was, what sacrifice looked like when it gleamed in the light and stayed silent on your chest. He never asked about it. Not once. All those years, not even a question about how I kept it clean, where I stored it, what it meant to the women before me. He looked at it like a prize at the end of some game he thought he was playing, as if being born to me made him worthy of everything I'd protected. I don't think it was malice, which somehow made it worse. It was assumption, entitlement so deeply woven into him that it didn't feel wrong to speak it out loud, to tell a room that he was already the owner. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled like mothers do, the polite kind, the kind that makes everyone else comfortable, and I cut the cake with the same hands that had once held him through every fever, every heartbreak, every night he came home from college without a word of thanks. I served slices of lemon almond with my best silver knife, the one from my wedding set, the one he'd never remember was a gift from my mother. I watched him laugh with his cousins and drink his third glass of wine, and I wondered when he'd stopped seeing me as a person. The thing people never tell you about motherhood is how much of it is invisible. You give and give until the giving becomes your identity, until the things you once loved become artifacts someone else assumes belong to them. You become the vault, the keeper, the placeholder until they're ready to receive what they think you've just been holding in trust. And if you dare to interrupt that script, to reclaim something, to say this is still mine, you're accused of betrayal. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I had been mistaken. This wasn't inheritance. This was erasure. By morning, I had made my decision. It came quiet, like most important decisions do, not from rage or grief, but from clarity, from a stillness I hadn't known in years. I stood in front of the cabinet and opened it like I was meeting an old friend, and there it was, nestled in its velvet cradle, untouched, but not unloved. My son thought he'd spoken a future into being, but I was still alive, still choosing. That necklace didn't belong to him, not because he wasn't my son, but because he'd never once asked what it had cost to keep. The next morning, I took the necklace from the cabinet and set it gently on the kitchen counter, beside my tea, beside the list of things I had once imagined passing down. The morning light caught the green like it was alive, like it was waiting for someone to truly see it. I sat for a long time, listening to the house settle around me, the creak of the floorboards I had refinished by hand, the quiet click of the heat kicking on. That necklace had never just been jewelry, it had always been a witness, and now it needed to be free. By 10, I was on the road, the necklace carefully wrapped in linen and stored inside the purse I only used for weddings and funerals. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't explain to my sister when she texted about brunch. I drove past the church where David was baptized, past the elementary school where he once cried into my jacket after forgetting his lines in a play. I kept driving, steady and certain, to a place where things were valued without sentiment, where stories didn't blur the numbers, where truth came with paperwork and appraisals. The first auction house was in the West End, tucked behind a row of designer boutiques, the kind of place you'd miss if you didn't know what it held inside. The woman who greeted me had kind eyes, though she asked pointed questions, and when I placed the necklace on the velvet square, her breath caught slightly, like it had surprised her. She didn't ask for its history, just began examining the setting with a magnifier, her voice low as she noted the cut, the age, the condition. I listened like I was hearing my own life explained in carats and clarity. She gave me a number, and it was higher than I expected, higher than I dared believe. I nodded and thanked her, though I didn't accept the offer. I needed to be sure, needed to know what the world thought this was worth, away from family rooms and birthdays. The second place was more clinical, more businesslike, the kind of office that smelled faintly of paper and polish. The appraiser there didn't smile, didn't soften his words, but his number was even higher, and I felt something loosen in my chest, like a door cracking open somewhere I'd forgotten existed. The third office had old floors and a fireplace that burned quietly in the corner, flickering like memory. The woman behind the desk asked if I wanted tea, and I said yes, though my hands shook a little as I unwrapped the necklace one more time. She examined it gently, reverently, like she understood that this wasn't just about money. Her number matched the others, give or take, and as she spoke, I found myself watching the flames, remembering my mother's hands zipping up my dress, my grandmother's voice humming low in the kitchen, all of it stored in emerald. Back in my car, I sat in silence, the envelope of appraisals beside me, the sun warming the dashboard, the world carrying on around me like it didn't know something sacred had just shifted. It wasn't just about the value, though $340,000 was more than I'd ever imagined. It was about what that number meant, what it proved. I wasn't just the keeper of something old. I was the last woman in a line who understood what it meant to guard a legacy with both hands, who had worn that necklace not as decoration, but as armor. And armor, I realized, could be sold. I drove home with the windows cracked, the wind soft and kind, and when I passed David's old high school, I didn't feel what I used to feel. There was no longing, no ache for the days when he'd run to the car with stories tumbling out of him. I felt distance, like I was watching someone else's memory. I parked, brought the envelope inside, and poured myself a second cup of tea. Then I opened my laptop, created a new email, and typed carefully, "Dear Christie's, I'd like to discuss a potential estate piece under a private listing." By evening, the necklace had a new name, 3-Generation Emerald Pendant, Private Collection. The listing was formal, elegant, stripped of sentiment. I read it twice before sending the final confirmation. There was a sense of steadiness in my chest, not triumph, just alignment. It was never about taking something away, it was about placing it where it could no longer be misused, where it would never again be assumed, pocketed, or joked about like some inevitability. I closed my laptop slowly, took a breath, and for the first time in a long time, the silence in my house felt full. The auction happened on a Wednesday, the kind of quiet middle of the weekday when most people are too busy to notice their lives shifting. I spent the morning folding towels, wiping down the baseboards, small things that gave me the illusion of control. By noon, I'd opened the old windows in my study, let the light stream through the lace curtains my mother sewed the year after my father died, the necklace long gone from the cabinet, the velvet box empty. The wood still holding the shape of what once rested there like a body-shaped absence. I watched the auction online, the screen a clean white stage for something so personal it felt indecent. The bids started just above the estimate, creeping up in tidy increments, names I didn't recognize flashing across the screen, collectors from London, a gallery in New York, someone in Singapore. I kept sipping my tea, kept my hands in my lap, but inside I felt something unspool, not grief exactly, but a shedding, like the necklace had never belonged to me, like I had only ever been its final witness before it passed into light and anonymity. When the bidding closed at $380,000, I didn't smile, didn't cry. I just sat there, still and alert, like something sacred had just ended without fanfare. The final number blinked on the screen, elegant and final, and I thought of my grandmother, her knuckles red from factory work, her voice sharp but kind when she'd tell me stories about saving silk ribbons during ration years. I imagined her watching this unfold, and I think, in some way, she would have understood, maybe not the technology or the money, but the decision to protect something by releasing it. The money arrived 2 days later, transferring into my account with the same soundless efficiency as an electric bill, just a line of numbers and a blinking green check. I stared at the confirmation for a long while, my tea untouched beside me, the scent of lemon and honey rising like memory. I thought of the years I'd worked double shifts at the hospital, the birthdays I missed, the holidays I powered through with calloused hands, always telling myself it was worth it, always believing that if I gave enough, my son would one day understand where everything came from. But understanding had never come. David had always assumed the comforts of our life were the default, not the result. When his father drank through 3 jobs, I worked nights. When the pipes burst one winter, I fixed them with my own hands. When he needed braces, I sold my wedding china without a word. I remember him showing off that new smile, cheeks red with pride, never once asking how we afforded it. It wasn't cruelty, it was blindness, the kind that grows when someone has only ever been on the receiving end of someone else's quiet desperation. That weekend, I printed out the paperwork for the foundation. I chose a name with weight, something rooted. The Brennan Women's Education Foundation. It sounded old, like it had always existed, like it belonged to a lineage that mattered. I signed the forms at my dining table, the one my mother gave me when I moved out at 20, the pen gliding with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. Every line I wrote felt like I was reclaiming something, time, memory, purpose, away from the expectations that had thinned me out for so long, like a woman carved to fit a frame. I funded the foundation entirely with the sale, all of it, without pause. The money was never mine to keep, it was meant to move, to multiply, to wrap itself around someone who still believed in their own becoming. The charter stated clearly, scholarships for first-generation college women, especially those in caregiving roles, especially those overlooked. I didn't need a board, I didn't want a committee. I needed action. I wanted girls who'd been told to wait, to shrink, to support someone else's dream, to look up and see their name written on something that dared to believe in them instead. On Monday, the foundation went live. Quietly, without press releases or handshakes. Just a form, a mission statement, a small corner of the internet where legacy could be redefined. I brewed tea in my grandmother's chipped porcelain pot and sat with my laptop open, reading the first application that came in before the sun had even set. A girl named Kaya, 21, working nights as a server, saving for community college, wants to be a nurse like her grandmother. I clicked approve before I even finished reading. The necklace had found her. And, through her, so had I. He came storming into my study on Tuesday, midday sun flaring behind him through the glass door, making his figure look almost childish in its urgency, shoulders squared like someone preparing for war but unsure of the battlefield. I didn't stand. I stayed at my desk, fingers resting on the foundation ledger, warm tea half sipped beside me, the kind of quiet that made anger sound louder than it deserved. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He went straight to the demand, as if I'd misplaced something of his instead of dismantled a fantasy he'd built without permission. "Where's the necklace?" he asked, breath clipped and voice edged with panic, as though I'd lost a car key or a watch, not something I had worn like armor across 3 generations. I didn't answer right away. I reached into the drawer, slid the auction receipt across the table, watched his eyes drop like gravity had suddenly increased. He didn't recognize the paper at first, didn't understand what it meant, not until his name failed to appear anywhere. Then I added the charter documents, stacked gently on top, signed and dated in blue ink, my name written clearly, his absence deliberate. He scanned the page, his mouth tightening with each line, eyes stuttering over the words like they'd betrayed him. "You sold it," he said, not quietly, as though the act itself was treason, as if legacy had been rerouted without his approval. "You had no right," he began, but I raised my hand, not sharply, just enough to pause him. "It sold for $380,000, I said evenly, and it's currently funding 20 full-ride scholarships. He laughed then, short and bitter, the sound of someone trying to regain control. "You think this is noble? This is theft," he said. "You stole my future." I didn't flinch. I told him he was welcome to apply, though we had strict merit requirements. I said it without venom, without sarcasm, just truth. He called me cruel, vindictive, used words like betrayal, inheritance, loyalty, as if I didn't know their weight already. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, red-faced and trembling when he lost something he assumed he deserved. But that boy had been told, yes, too often. That boy had grown into a man who believed history was something he could pocket. When he ran out of insults, I handed him the second envelope, the one I'd prepared months ago, long before the birthday dinner, long before he thought to announce his ownership over something he'd never asked about. Inside were printed emails, ones I'd found on the family computer, months of messages between him and his girlfriend, their shared plans to sell the necklace after I died, their jokes about updating my will, their casual suggestions that it might be easier if I went quickly, if I got too difficult. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I let the pages speak. He turned pale as he read, his breath catching at certain lines, his mouth opening like he wanted to explain, but couldn't find the place to begin. I didn't help him. I just said what needed to be said. That necklace belonged to women who built lives out of ash. My grandmother worked in a munitions factory, my mother taught for 30 years while raising 4 children alone, and I paid for your tuition mopping hospital floors and changing sheets in graveyard silence. What have you built, besides assumptions? The question hung between us unanswered as he folded the pages slowly. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him like punctuation. I listened to the tires screech out of the driveway, a sharp departure with nowhere to land. I didn't chase after him. I didn't call my sister. I returned to my desk, where the afternoon light had shifted across the floor, softening the sharp edges of everything he'd tried to tear open. My inbox held 3 new applications. One girl wrote about studying biology while raising her baby sister, another about learning English after escaping an abusive home. The third just said, "I'm tired of apologizing for being ambitious." I approved all 3. The room felt warm, the way old homes do when you've filled them with intention. I thought of my grandmother again, her hands always moving, her voice low but certain, telling me once that silence isn't weakness, it's patience. Some things don't need to be fought, they just need to be finished. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't punishment. This was a woman deciding her story wouldn't end in waiting. My son had thought legacy meant ownership. I was teaching him that it meant stewardship, and that the truest kind of inheritance doesn't get passed down, it gets built forward. The house settled into quiet after he left, a kind of stillness that felt earned, like the air itself had shifted, like it understood something had finally been said aloud that needed saying. I walked to the window and watched the street, empty but expectant, the same sidewalk where I once stood cheering as David learned to ride his bike, the same curb where I waded through teenage curfews and slammed doors. The silence didn't feel like loneliness, it felt like a clearing, a space that had finally been made honest, unburdened by the weight of waiting for someone to change. I made more tea, jasmine this time, the one my grandmother used to drink when she wanted to think, and I carried it back to my desk where the foundation dashboard blinked quietly, its soft glow casting a faint light over the photos pinned on the bulletin board above. My mother in her graduation robe, older than most of her classmates, my grandmother in uniform, eyes sharp and proud, and a picture of me holding David the day we brought him home. Wrapped in the blanket I'd knitted during long overnight shifts at the hospital. All of us, builders in our own way. There was a new application waiting. A girl named Selena. Her handwriting was careful, her answers full of grit. Not desperation, just clarity. She worked 2 jobs, took care of her mother who'd just finished chemo, and still kept her GPA high enough to make her counselor cry. Her essay wasn't polished, but it was real, and when I read her line about becoming a nurse because my grandmother held my hand through every blood test, I felt something deep in me soften, not because it was familiar, but because it was sacred. The kind of hope that doesn't ask permission. I approved her instantly, watched her name join the others in the spreadsheet, the column marked awarded turning green, like spring breaking through winter. Each name on that list felt like a thread pulling something forward. Each scholarship a quiet refusal to let hard-earned wisdom be buried under someone else's convenience. My son wouldn't know their names, wouldn't sit on the board, wouldn't shake their hands at ceremonies. But I would. I would read every essay, sign every check, watch these women step into rooms they weren't born invited into, and I would know what the necklace had become. There was no announcement, no family meeting, no explanation for why the necklace was gone. David didn't call after that day, didn't write, didn't try to plead or reason. Maybe he thought time would make me soften. Maybe he assumed I'd eventually miss him enough to overlook everything he'd said, everything he'd planned. But I didn't miss him the way I thought I would. I missed the boy he used to be, the one who asked to sleep beside me during storms, the one who cried when I left notes in his lunchbox. That version of him had been gone for years. Sometimes I think love turns into memory before we're ready to admit it. I still keep his baby shoes in a box under the bed, still have his drawings from 2nd grade, sunshines with faces and lopsided hearts that say Mom. I haven't thrown them out. I don't plan to. I can love the child he was without clinging to the man he became. I can let him go without bitterness, without making it a statement. It's just something that needed to happen, the way leaves fall when it's time, not because they want to, but because the tree needs space to keep living. Every now and then I get letters, handwritten notes from scholarship recipients, sometimes tucked into their applications, sometimes mailed months later with graduation announcements or photos of them in scrubs, holding diplomas, standing next to proud mothers. One girl wrote, "Thank you for believing in someone you never met," and I sat at the kitchen table with the letter pressed to my chest, letting the gratitude pass through me like wind through an open window. This was the legacy, not the gold, not the emerald, not the velvet box. It was the belief that something better could grow when women were given ground to stand on. I walk most mornings now, before the sun gets too high, before the world fills with noise. I pass the church, the school, the old bakery where I used to buy David his favorite muffin after dentist visits. I nod at the neighbors, pet the dogs, wave at the mailman. And then I come home, steep my tea, open my laptop, and read stories from young women who remind me that inheritance is not about blood or birthright, it's about continuation. My son believed the necklace was his because of who I was. But these women earned it because of who they're becoming.